Hello. Today we will discuss theme 3 of ancient India, kinship, caste, and class, early societies, circa 600 BCE to 600 CE. Okay. In the previous chapter, we saw that there were several changes in the economic and political life between circa 600 BCE and 600 CE. Some of these changes influenced societies as well. For instance, the extension of agriculture into forested areas transformed the lives of forest dwellers. Craft specialists often emerged as distinct social groups. The unequal distribution of wealth sharpened social differences. Historians often use textual traditions to understand these processes. Some texts lay down norms of social behavior. Others describe and occasionally comment on a wide range of social situations and practices. We can also catch a glimpse of some social actors from inscription. As we will see, each text and inscription was written from the perspective of specific social categories. So we need to keep in mind who composed what and for whom. We also need to consider the languages used and the ways in which the text circulated. Used carefully, text allow us to piece together attitudes and practices that shaped social histories. In focusing on the Mahabharata, a colossal epic running in its present form into over 1 lakh verses with depictions of a wide range of social categories and situations. We draw on one of the richest texts of the subcontinent. It was composed over a period of about 1,000 years, circa 500 BCE onwards, and some of the stories it contains may have been in circulation even earlier. The central story is about two sets of warring cousins. The text also contains sections laying down norms of behavior for various social groups. Occasionally, though not always, the principal characters seem to follow these norms. What does conformity with norms and deviations from them signify? Okay, here is a figure, a terracotta sculpture depicting a scene from the Mahabharata, West Bengal, circa 7th century, 17th century. Okay, the critical edition of the Mahabharata, one of the most ambitious projects of scholarship, began in 1919 under the leadership of a noted Indian Sanskritist, V.S. Sutkankar. A team comprising dozens of scholars initiated the task of preparing a critical edition of the Mahabharata. What exactly did this involve? Initially, it meant collecting Sanskrit manuscripts of the text written in a variety of scripts from different parts of the country. And the team worked out a method of comparing verses from each manuscript. Ultimately, they selected the verses that appeared common to most versions and published these in several volumes, running into over 13,000 pages. The project took 47 years to complete. Two things became apparent. There were several common elements in the Sanskrit version of the story, evident in manuscripts found all over the subcontinent, from Kashmir and Nepal in the north to Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the south. Also evident were enormous regional variations in the ways in which the text has been transmitted over the centuries. These variations were documented in footnotes and appendices to the main text. Taken together, more than half the 13,000 pages are devoted to these variations. In a sense, these variations are reflective of the complex processes that shaped early and later social histories. Through dialogues between dominant traditions and resilient local ideas and practices, these dialogues are characterized by moments of conflict as well as consensus. Our understanding of these processes is derived primarily from texts written in Sanskrit by and for Brahmanas. When issues of social history were explored for the first time by historians in the 19th and 20th centuries, they tended to take these texts at face value, believing that everything that was laid down in these texts was actually practiced. Subsequently, scholars began studying other traditions from works in Pali, Prakrit, and Tamil. These studies indicated that the ideas contained in normative Sanskrit texts were on the whole recognized as authoritative. They were also questioned and occasionally even rejected. It is important to keep this in mind as we examine how historians reconstruct social histories. Okay. Here you can see a section of a page from the critical edition. This section printed in large bold letters is part of the main text. The smaller print lists variations in different manuscripts which were carefully catalogued. Okay, second is kinship and marriage. Many rules and varied practices. Finding out about families. We often take family life for granted. However, you may have noticed that not all families are identical. They vary in terms of numbers of members, their relationship with one another, as well as the kinds of activities they share. Often, people belong to the same family, share food and other resources, and live, work, and perform rituals together. Families are usually parts of larger networks of people defined as relatives, or to use a more technical term, kinfolk. Okay, while familial ties are often regarded as natural and based on blood, they are defined in many different ways. For instance, some societies regard cousins as being blood relations, whereas others do not. For early societies, historians can retrieve information about elite families fairly easily. It is, however, far more difficult to reconstruct the familial relationships of ordinary people. Historians also investigate and analyze attitudes towards family and kinship. These are important because they provide an insight into people's thinking. It is likely that some of these ideas would have shaped their actions, just as actions may have led to changes in attitudes. The ideal of patrilineal. Can we identify points when kinship relations changed? At one level, the Mahabharata is a story about this. It describes a feud over land and power between two groups of cousins, the Kauravas and Pandavas, who belong to a single ruling family, that of Kurus, a lineage dominating one of the Janapadas. Ultimately, the conflict ended in a battle in which the Pandavas emerged victorious. After that, patrilineal succession was proclaimed. While patrilineal had existed prior to the composition of the epic, the central story of the Mahabharata reinforced the idea that it was valuable. Under patrilineal, sons could claim the resources, including the throne in the case of kings, of their fathers when they later died. Most ruling dynasties, circa 6th century BCE onwards, claimed to follow this system, although there were variations in practice. Sometimes there were no sons. In some situations, brothers succeeded one another. Sometimes other kinsmen claimed the throne, and in very exceptional circumstances, women such as Prabhavati Gupta exercised power. The concern with patrilineal was not unique to ruling families. It is evident in the mantras in ritual texts such as Rigveda. It is possible that these attitudes were shared by wealthy men and those who claimed high status, including Brahmanas. Okay. Terms for family and kin. Sanskrit text use the term kula to designate families and nyatti for the larger network of kingfolk. Okay, the term vamsha is used for lineage. Okay, patrilineal means tracing descent from father to son, grandson, and so on. Matrilineal is the term used when descent is traced through mother. Okay, map 1, the Kuru Panjala region and neighboring areas. Here you can see the Kuru Panjala region and the neighboring areas. Okay, Ujjaini, Avanti, Kaushambi, Bodh Gaya, Patliputra, Vaishali, Varanasi, Sarnath, Valsa, Ayodhya, Kushinagara, Pava, Lumpini, Kapilavastu, Sakya, Malla, Koshala, Shravasti, Yamuna, Ganga, Mathura, Malsya, Virada, Shurasena, Kuru, Indraprastha, Hastinapura. Okay, producing fine sons. Here is an excerpt of a mantra from the Rig Veda, which probably inserted in the text circa 1000 BCE to be chanted by the priest while conducting the marriage ritual. It is used in many Hindu weddings even today. I free her from here, but not from there. I have bound her firmly there, so that through the grace of Indra, she will have fine sons and be fortunate in her husband's love. Indra was one of the principal deities, a god of valor, warfare, and rain. Here and there refers to the father's and husband's house, respectively. Okay. Why kinfolk quarreled? This is an excerpt from the Adi Parvan, literally the first section of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, describing why conflicts arose amongst the Kauravas and Pandyas. The Kauravas were the sons of Dhritarashtra, and the Pandavas were their cousins. Since Dhritarashtra was blind, his younger brother Pandu ascended the throne of Hastinapura. However, after the premature death of Pandu, Dhritarashtra became king, as the royal princes were still very young. As the princes grew up together, the citizens of Hastinapura began to express their preferences for the Pandavas, for they were more capable and virtuous than Kauravas. This made Duryodhana, the eldest son of Kauravas, jealous. He approached his father and said, "You yourself did not receive the throne, although it fell to you because of your defect. If the Pandava receives the patrimony from Pandu, his son will surely inherit it in turn, and so will his son and his. We ourselves, with our sons, shall be excluded from the royal succession and become of slight regard in the eyes of the world, Lord of the earth." Passages such as these may not have been literally true, but they give us an idea about what those who wrote the text thought. Sometimes, as in this case, they contain conflicting ideas. Okay. Rules of marriage. While sons were important for the continuity of the patrilineage, daughters were viewed rather differently within this framework. While sons were important for the continuity of the patrilineage, daughters were viewed rather differently within this framework. They had no claims to the resources of the household. At the same time, marrying into families outside the kin was considered desirable. This system, called exogamy, literally marrying outside, meant that lives of young girls and women belonging to families that claimed high status were often carefully regulated to ensure that they were married at the right time and to the right person. This gave rise to the belief of Kanya Dana, or the gift of a daughter in marriage. Kanyadana, or gift of a daughter in marriage, was an important religious duty of the father. Okay, with the emergence of new towns, social life became more complex. People from near and far met to buy and sell their products and share ideas in the urban milieu. This may have led to questioning of earlier beliefs and practices. Faced this challenge, the Brahmanas responded by laying down codes of social behavior in great detail. These were meant to be followed by Brahmanas in particular and the rest of the society in general. From circa 500 BCE, these norms were compiled in Sanskrit texts known as the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. The most important of such works, the Manusmriti, was compiled between circa 200 BCE to 200 CE, while the Brahmana authors of these texts claimed that their point of view had universal validity and that what they prescribed had to be obeyed by everybody. It is likely that real social relations were more complicated. Given the regional diversity within the subcontinent and the difficulties of communication, the influence of Brahmanas was by no means all pervasive. What is interesting is that Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras recognized as many as 8 forms of marriage. Of these, the first 4 were considered as good, while the remaining were condemned. It is possible that these were practiced by those who did not accept Brahmanical norms. Okay. Types of marriages. Types of marriages: endogamy, exogamy, polygyny, polyandry. Endogamy refers to the marriage within a unit. This could be a kin group, a caste, or a group living in the same locality. Exogamy refers to marriage outside the unit. Polygyny is the practice of a man having several wives. Polyandry is the practice of a woman having several husbands. Okay. 8 forms of marriage. Here are the first, fourth, fifth, and sixth forms of marriage from the Manusmriti. First, the gift of a daughter. After dressing her in costly clothes and honoring her with presents and jewels, to a man learned in the Veda, whom the father himself invites. Fourth, the gift of a daughter by the father after he has addressed the couple with the text, may both of you perform your duties together, and has shown honor to the bridegroom. Fifth, when the bridegroom receives a maiden after having given as much wealth as he can afford to the kinsman and to the bride herself according to his own will. Sixth, the voluntary union of a maiden and her lover, which springs from desire. Okay. The Gotra of women. The Gotra of women. One Brahmanical practice, evident from circa 1000 BCE onwards, was to classify people, especially Brahmanas, in terms of Gotras. Each Gotra Each Gotra was named after a Vedic seer, and all those who belonged to the same Gotra were regarded as his descendants. Two rules about Gotra were particularly important. Women were expected to give up their father's Gotra and adopt that of their husband on marriage, and members of the same Gotra could not marry. One way to find out whether this was commonly followed is to consider the names of men and women, which were sometimes derived from Gotra names. These names are available for powerful ruling lineages, such as Shadavahanas, who ruled over the western parts of Western India and Deccan, circa 2nd century BCE to 2nd century CE. Several of their inscriptions have been recovered, which allow historians to trace family ties, including marriages. Okay. Names of Shadavahana kings from inscriptions. These are the names of several generations of Shadavahana rulers recovered from inscriptions. Note the uniform title Raja. Also note the following word which ends with the term Puda, a Prakrit word meaning sun. Okay. The term Godami Putta means son of Godami. Names like Godami and Vasishti are feminine forms of Godama and Vasishta, Vedic seers after whom Gotras were renamed. Raja Godami Putta, Siri Shadakani. Raja Vasishti Putta Sami, Siri Pulumai. Raja Godami Putta Swami Siri Yana Shadakani. Raja Madari Putta Swami Sagasena. Raja Vasadi Putta Shadarapana Sadakani. Raja Haridi Putta Vinhu Kada Chuttu Kulanmada Shadakani. Raja Godami Putta Siri Vijaya Sadakani. Okay. A Shadavahana ruler. Figure 3.3 is depicting a Shadavahana ruler and his wife. This is one of the rare sculptures depictions of a ruler from the wall of a cave donated to Buddhist monks. This sculpture dates to circa 2nd century BCE. Okay. Metronomics in Upanishads. Metronomics in Upanishads. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the earliest Upanishads, contains a list of successive generations of teachers and students, many of whom were designated by metronomics. Metronymics. Okay, a mother's advice. The Mahabharata describes how when a war between Kauravas and Pandavas became almost inevitable, Gandhari made one last appeal to her eldest son Duryodhana. By making peace, you honor your father and me, as well as your well wishers. It is the wise man in control of his senses who guards his kingdom. Greed and anger drag a man away from his profits. By defeating these two enemies, a king conquers the earth. You will happily enjoy the earth, my son, along with the wise and heroic Pandavas. There is no good in a war, no law, dharma, and profit, artha. Let happiness, let alone happiness, nor is there necessarily victory in the end. Do not set your mind on war. Duryodhana did not listen to this advice and fought and lost the war. Okay. Some of the Shadavana rulers were polygynous. That is, they had more than one wife. Okay, an examination of the names of women who married Shadavana rulers indicates that many of them had names derived from Gotras, such as Godama and Vasishta, their fathers' Gotras. They evidently retained these names instead of adopting names derived from their husband's Gotra name as they were required to do according to Brahmanical rules. What is also apparent is that some of these women belong to the same Gotra. As is obvious, this ran counter to the ideal of exogamy recommended in the Brahmanical texts. In fact, it exemplified an alternative practice, that of endogamy or marriage within the kin group, which was and is prevalent amongst several communities in South India. Such marriages amongst kinfolk, such as cousins, ensured a close knit community. It is likely that there were variations in other parts of the subcontinent as well, but as yet it has not been possible to reconstruct specific details. Were mothers important? We have seen that Shatavahana rulers were identified through metronymics, names derived from their that of the mother. Although this may suggest that mothers were important, we need to be cautious before we arrive at any conclusion. In the case of the Chadavanas, we know that succession to the throne was generally patrilineal. Okay. In figure 3.4, it is depicted a battle scene. Okay, this is amongst the earliest sculptural depictions of a scene from Mahabharata, a terracotta sculpture from the walls of a temple in Achichatra, Uttar Pradesh, circa 5th century CE. Okay, social differences within and beyond the framework of caste. Social differences within and beyond the framework of caste. You are probably familiar with the term caste, which refers to a set of hierarchically ordered social categories. The ideal order was laid down in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. Brahmanas claimed that this order, in which they were ranked first, was divinely ordained, while placing groups classified as Shudras and untouchables at the very bottom of the social order. Positions within the order were supposed determined by birth. The right occupation. The Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras also contained rules about the ideal occupations of the four categories or varnas. Brahmanas were supposed to study and teach Vedas, perform sacrifices and get sacrifices performed, and give and receive gifts. Kshatriyas were engaged in warfare, protect people, and administer justice, study the Vedas, get sacrifices performed, and make gifts. The last three occupations were also assigned to the Vaishyas, which are the that last three occupations. Protect, okay, protect people and administer justice, study the Vedas, get sacrifices performed, and make gifts. Okay, study the Vedas, get sacrifices performed, and make gifts. The last three occupations were also assigned to the Vaishyas, which were who were in addition expected to engage in agriculture, pastoralism, and trade. Shudras were assigned only one occupation, that of serving the three higher varnas. Brahmanas evolved two or three strategies for enforcing these norms. One, as we have just seen, was to assert that the varna order was of divine origin. Second, that they advised the kings to ensure that these norms were followed within their kingdoms. As third, they attempted to persuade the people that their status was determined by birth. However, this was not always easy, so prescriptions were often reinforced by stories told in the Mahabharata and other texts. A divine order. A divine order? To justify their claims, Brahmanas often cited a verse from a hymen in the Rig Veda known as Purusha Sukta, describing the sacrifices of Purusha, the primeval man. All the elements of the universe, including the four social categories, were supposed to have emanated from his body. The Brahmana was his mouth. Of his arms was made the Kshatriya. His thighs became Vaishya, and of his feet the Shudra was born. Proper social roles. Here is a story from the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata. Once the Drona, a Brahmana who taught archery to the Kuru princess, was approached by Ekalavya, a forest-dwelling Nishada, a hunting community. When Drona, who knew the Dharma, refused to have him as his pupil, Ekalavya returned to the forest, prepared an image of Drona out of clay, and treating it as his teacher, began to practice on his own way, on his own. In due course, he acquired great skill in archery. One day, Kuru princess went hunting and their dog, wandering in the woods, came upon Ekalavya. When the dog smelt the dark Nishada wrapped in black deer skin, Ekalavya shot 7 arrows into its mouth. When the dog returned to the Pandavas, they were amazed at this super display of archery. They tracked down Ekalavya, who introduced himself as a pupil of Drona. Drona had once told his favorite student, Arjuna, that he would be unrivaled amongst his pupils. Arjuna now reminded Drona about this. Drona approached Ekalavya, who immediately acknowledged and honored him as his teacher. When Drona demanded his right thumb as his fee, Ekalavya unhesitatingly cut it off and offered it. But thereafter, when he showed with his remaining fingers, he was no longer as fast as he had been before. Thus, Drona kept his word. No one was better than Arjuna. Non-Kshatriya kings. Non-Kshatriya kings. According to Shastras, only Kshatriyas could be kings. However, several important ruling lineages probably had different origins. The social background of the Mauryas who ruled over a large empire has been hotly debated. While later Buddhist texts suggested they were Kshatriyas, Brahmanical texts described them as being of low origin. The Shungas and Kanvas, the immediate successors of the Mauryas, were Brahmanas. In fact, the political power was effectively open to anyone who could muster support and resources, and rarely dependent on birth as Kshatriya. Other rulers, such as the Shagas, who came from Central Asia, were regarded as mlechas, barbarians or outsiders by the Brahmanas. However, one of the earliest inscriptions in the Sanskrit describes how Rudradaman, the best known Shaga ruler, circa 2nd century CE, rebuilt Sudarshana Lake. Okay, this suggests that powerful mlechas were familiar with Sanskritic traditions. It is also interesting that the best known ruler of Shadavana dynasty, Gautami Putra Siri Sadakani, claimed to be both unique Brahmana, Ega Brahmana, and the destroyer of the pride of Kshatriyas. He also claimed to have ensured that there was no intermarriage amongst members of the four Varnas. At the same time, he entered into the marriage alliance with the king of Rudradaman. As you can see from this example, integration within the framework of caste was often complicated process. The Shatavahanas claimed to be Brahmins, whereas according to the Brahmanas, kings ought to have been Kshatriyas. They claimed to uphold the fourfold Varna order, but entered into marriage alliances with people who were supposed to be excluded from the system. And as we have seen, they practiced endogamy instead of the exogamous system recommended in the Brahmanical texts. Okay, here you can see the silver coin depicting a Shaka ruler, century, fourth century, circa fourth century. Okay, Jadis and mobile social mobility. Jadis and social mobility. These complexities are reflected in another term used in the text to refer to social categories. Jadi. In Brahmanical theory, Jadi, like Varna, was based on birth. However, while the number of Varnas was fixed at four, there was no restriction on the number of Jadis. In fact, wherever the Brahmanical authorities encountered new groups, for instance, people living in forests such as the Nishadas, who or wanted to assign a game to occupational categories such as the goldsmith or Suvarnakara, which did not easily fit into the fourfold Varna system. They Jadis which shared a common occupation or profession were sometimes organized into shrenis or guilds. We seldom come across documents that record the histories of these groups, but there are exceptions. One interesting stone inscription that is circa 5th century CE, found in Mandsaur, Madhya Pradesh, records the history of a guild of silk weavers who originally lived in Latha, Gujarat. From where they migrated to Madagascar, then known as Dashaputra. It states that they undertook the difficult journey along with their children and kinfolk, as they had heard about the greatness of the local king and wanted to settle in his kingdom. In the transcription provides a fascinating glimpse of complex social processes and provides insights into the nature of guilds or srenis, although membership was based on a shared craft specialization. Some members adopted other occupations. It also indicates that members shared more than a common profession. They collectively decided to invest their wealth earned through their craft to construct a splendid temple in Ragacha. Okay, they collectively decided to invest their wealth through their craft to construct a splendid temple in honor of the sun god. The case of the merchants. Okay, the case of the merchants. Sanskrit texts and inscriptions used the term vanik to designate merchants, while trade was defined as an occupation for Vaishyas in the Shastras. A more complex situation is evident in the plays such as Mrichagadiga written by Shudraga. Mrichagadiga written by Shudraga circa 4th century CE. Here, the hero Charudatta was described as both a Brahmana and a Sartavaha or merchant, and a 50th century inscription describes two brothers who made a donation for the construction of a temple as Kshatriya Vaniks. What the silk weavers did. Here is an excerpt from the inscription, which is in Sanskrit. Some are intensely attached to music, placing to ear. Others, being proud of 100 excellent biographies, are conversant with wonderful tales, filled with humility, are absorbed in excellent religious discourses. Some excel in their own religious rites, likewise by others who were self-possessed The science of Vedic astronomy was mastered, and others valorous in battle, even today forcibly cause harm to the enemies. Beyond the four varnas, integration. Given the diversity of the subcontinent, there were and always have been populations whose social practices were not influenced by Brahmanical ideas. When they figure in Sanskrit texts, they are often described as odd, uncivilized, or even animal like. In some instances, these included forest dwellers, for whom hunting and gathering remained an important means of subsistence. Categories such as the Nishada, to which Ekalavya is supposed to have belonged, are examples of this. Others who were viewed with suspicion included populations such as nomadic pastoralists, who could not be easily accommodated within the framework of settled agriculturalists. Sometimes those who spoke non-Sanskrit languages were labeled as mlechas and looked down upon. There was nonetheless also a sharing of ideas and beliefs between these people. Nature of the relations is evident in those stories in Mahabharata. A tiger-like husband. This is a summary of a story from the Adi Parvan of Mahabharata. The Pandavas had fled into the forest. They were tried and fell asleep. Only Bhima, the second Pandava, renowned for his prowess, was keeping watch. A man-eating Rakshasa caught the scent of the Pandavas and sent his sister Hidimba to capture them. She fell in love with Bhima, transformed herself into a lovely maiden, and proposed to him. He refused. Meanwhile, the Rakshasa arrived and challenged Bhima to a wrestling match. Bhima accepted the challenge and killed him. The others woke up hearing the noise. Hidimba introduced herself and declaring her love for Bhima. She told Kundi, I have forsaken my friends, my dharma, and my kin, and good lady, chosen your tiger-like son for my man. Whether you think me a fool or your devoted servant, let me join you, great lady, with your son as my husband. Ultimately, Yudhishthira agreed to the marriage on condition that they would spend the day together, but that Bhima would return every night. The couple roamed all over the world during the day. In due course, Hidimba gave birth to Rakshasa boy named Gadol-gaja. Then the mother and son left the Pandavas. Gadol-gaja promised to return to the Pandavas whenever they needed him. Some historians suggest that the term Rakshasa is used to describe people who practices differed from those laid down in Brahmanical texts. Beyond the four varnas, subordination and conflict. While the Brahmanas considered some people as being outside the system, they also developed a sharper social divide by classifying certain social categories as untouchable. This rested on a notion that certain activities, especially those connected with the performance of rituals, were sacred and by extension pure. Those who considered themselves pure avoided taking food from those they designated as untouchable. In sharp contrast to the purity aspect, some activities were regarded as particularly polluting. These included handling corpse and dead animals. Those who performed such tasks, designated as chandalas, were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Their touch, and in some cases, even seeing them, was regarded as polluting by those who claimed to be at the top of the social order. Okay, here it's a depiction of a mendicant seeking alms, stone sculpture, Gandhara, circa 3rd century CE. Okay. The Manusmriti laid down the duties of the Chandalas. They had to live outside the village, use discarded utensils, and wear clothes of the dead and the ornaments of iron. They could not walk about in villages and cities at night. They had to dispose of the bodies of those who had no relatives and serve as executioners. Much later, the Chinese Buddhist monk Fa Hian, circa 5th century CE, wrote that untouchables had to sound a clapper in the streets so that people could avoid seeing them. Another Chinese pilgrim, Zhuan Sang, circa 7th century, observed that executioners and scavengers were forced to live outside the city. By examining non-Brahmanical texts which depicts the lives of Chandalas, historians have tried to find out whether Chandalas accepted the life of degradation prescribed in the Shastras. Sometimes these depictions correspond with those in Brahmanical texts, but occasionally there are hints of different social realities. Okay, the Bodhisattva as a Chandala. Did Chandalas resist the attempts to push them to the bottom of the social order? Read this story, which is part of the Madanga Jataka, a Pali text, where Bodhisattva, the Buddha in the previous birth, is identified as Chandala. Once the Bodhisattva was born outside the city of a Banaras as a Chandala's son and named Madanga. One day, when he had gone to the city on some work. He encountered Ditta Mangaliga, the daughter of a merchant. When she saw him, she exclaimed, "I have seen something inauspicious," and washed her eyes. The angry hangers on then beat him up. In protest, he went and lay down at the door of her father's house. On the seventh day, they brought out the girl and gave her to him. She carried the starving Madanga back to the Chandala settlement. Once he returned home, he decided to renounce the world. After attaining spiritual powers, he returned to Banaras and married her. A son named Mandavya Kumara was born to them. He learned the three Vedas as he grew up and began to provide food to 16,000 Brahmanas every day. One day, Madanga, dressed in rags, which a clay arms bowl in his hand, arrived at his son's doorstep and begged for food. Mandavya replied that he looked like an outcast and was unworthy of alms. The food was meant for the Brahmanas. Madanga said, "Those who are proud of their birth and are ignorant do not deserve gifts. On the contrary, those who are free from vices are worthy of offerings." Mandavya lost his temper and asked his servants to throw the man out. Madanga rose in the air and disappeared. When Titta Mangaliga learned about the incident, she followed Madanga and begged his forgiveness. He asked her to take a bit of the leftover from his bowl and give it to Mandavya and the Brahmanas. Okay. Beyond birth, resources and status. If you recall the economic relations discussed in the chapter 2, you will realize that slaves, landless agricultural laborers, hunters, fisher folk, pastoralists, peasants, village headmen, craft persons, merchants, and kings emerged as a social actors in different parts of the subcontinent. Their social positions were often shaped by their access to economic resources. Here, we will examine the social implications of access to resources in certain specific situations. Gendered access to property. Consider first a critical episode in the Mahabharata. During the course of the long drawn rivalry between the Kauravas and the Pandyas, Duryodhana invited Yudhishthira to a game of dice. The latter, who was deceived by his rival, staked his gold, elephants, chariots, slaves, army, treasury, kingdom, the property of his subjects, his brothers, and finally himself, and lost all. Then he staked their common wife Draupadi and lost her too. Issues of ownership, foregrounded in stories such as this one, also a figure in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. According to Manusmriti, the paternal estate was to be divided equally amongst sons after the death of the parents, with a special share for the eldest. Women could not claim a share of these resources. However, women were allowed to retain the gifts that they received on the occasion of their marriage as Sridhana, literally a woman's wealth. This could be inherited by their children without the husband having any claim on it. At the same time, the Manusmriti warned women against hoarding family property or even their own valuables without the husband's permission. You have read about wealthy women such as the Vagadaga queen Prabhavati Gupta. However, cumulative evidence, both epigraphic and textual, suggests that while upper class women may have had access to resources, land, cattle, and money, were generally controlled by men. In in other words, social differences between men and women were sharpened because of the differences in access to resources. Okay. Draupadi's question. Draupadi is supposed to have asked Yudhishthira whether he had lost himself before taking her. Two contrary opinions were expressed in response to this question. One, that even if Yudhishthira had lost himself earlier, his wife remained under his control, so he could take her. Two, that an unfree man, as Yudhishthira was when he had lost himself, could not take another person. The matter remained unresolved. Ultimately, Dhritarashtra restored to the Pandavas and Draupadi their personal freedom. Okay. How could men and women acquire wealth? For men, the Manusmriti declares there are seven means of acquiring wealth: inheritance, finding, purchase, conquest, investment, work, and acceptance of gifts from good people. For women, there are six means of acquiring wealth: what was given in front of the fire, marriage, or the bridal procession, or a token of affection, and what she got from her brother, mother, or father. She could also acquire wealth through any subsequent gift and whatever her affectionate husband might give her. Varna and the access to property. Varna and access to property. According to Brahmanical text, another criterion apart from gender for regulating access to wealth was Varna. As we saw earlier, the only occupation prescribed for Shudras was servitude, while a variety of occupations were listed for men of the first three varnas. If these provisions were actually implemented, the wealthiest men would have been the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas. That is, corresponded to some extent with social realities, is evident from the descriptions of priests and kings in other textual traditions. Kings are almost invariably depicted as wealthy. Priests are also generally shown to be rich, though there are occasional depictions of the poor Brahmana. At another level, even as the Brahmanical view of society was codified in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras, other traditions developed critiques of the Varna order. Some of the best known of these were developed within early Buddhism, circa 6th century BCE onwards. Okay, the Buddhists recognized that there were differences in society but did not regard these as natural or inflexible. They also rejected the ideas of claims to status on the basis of birth. The wealthy Shudra. This story, based on the Buddhist text in Pali known as Majjhima Nikaya. Majjhima Nikaya is a part of a dialogue between a king named Avantiputta and a disciple of the Buddha named Kachana. A Buddhist text in Pali known as Majjhima Nikaya is a part of a dialogue between a king named Avantiputta and a disciple of the Buddha named Kachana. While it may not be literally true, it reveals Buddhist attitudes toward Varna. Avantiputta asked Kachana what he thought about Brahmanas, who held that they were the best caste and that all other castes were low, that Brahmanas were a fair caste while all other castes were dark, that only Brahmanas were pure, not non Brahmanas, that Brahmanas were sons of Brahma, born of his mouth, born of Brahma, formed by Brahma, heirs to Brahma. Kachana replied, what if a Shudra were wealthy? Would another Shudra or a Kshatriya or a Brahmana or a Vaishya speak politely to him? Avantiputta replied that if a Shudra had wealth or corn or gold or silver, he could have as his obedient servant another Shudra to get up earlier than he, to go to rest later, to carry out his orders, to speak politely. Or he could even have a Kshatriya or a Brahmana or a Vaishya as his obedient servant. Kachana asked, this being so, are not these four varnas exactly the same? Avantiputta considered that there was no difference amongst the varnas of this count. Okay, an alternative social scenario, sharing wealth. So far, we have been examining situations where people either claimed or were assigned status on the basis of their wealth. However, there were other possibilities as well. Situations where men who were generous were respected, while those who were miserly or simply accumulated wealth for themselves were despised. One area where these values were cherished was ancient Tamilagam, where, as we saw earlier, there were several chiefdoms around 2000 years ago. Amongst the other things, the chiefs were patrons of bards and poets who sang their praise. Poems included in the Tamil Sangam anthologies often illuminate social and economic relationships, suggesting that while there were differences between rich and poor, those who controlled resources were also expected to share them. The poor generous chief. Okay, in this composition from the Purananuru, one of the anthologies of the poems of Tamil Sangam literature, circa first century, a bard describes his patron to other poets thus. Okay. Okay. In figure 3.7, you can see a chief and his follower. Stone culture. Amravati, Andhra Pradesh, circa second century CE. Okay, you can see a chief and his follower. Okay. Explaining social differences, a social contract. The Buddhists also developed an alternative understanding of social inequalities and of the institutions required to regulate social conflict in a myth found in a text known as the Sutta Pidaka. Sutta Pidaka, they suggested that originally human beings did not have fully evolved bodily forms, nor was the world of plants fully developed. All beings lived in a idyllic, idyllic state of peace, taking from nature only what they needed for each meal. However, there was a gradual deterioration of this state as human beings became increasingly greedy, vindictive, and deceitful. This led to them to wonder what if we were to select a certain being who should be wrathful when indignation is right, who should censure that which should rightly to be censured and should banish him who deserves to be banished. We will give him in return a proportion of the rice chosen by the whole people. He will be known as Mahasammatta, the great elect. This suggests that the institution of kinships was based on human choice, with taxes as a form of payment for services rendered by the king. At the same time, it reveals recognition of human agency in creating and institutionalizing economic and social relations. There are other implications as well. For instance, if human beings were responsible for the creation of the system, they could also change it in future. Handling texts, historians and the Mahabharata. If you look through the sources cited in this chapter, once more, you will notice that historians consider several elements when they analyze texts. They examine whether texts were written in Prakrit, Pali, or Tamil languages that were probably used by ordinary people, or in Sanskrit, a language meant almost exclusively for priests and elites. They also consider the kinds of text. Were these mantras learned and chanted by ritual specialists, or stories that people could have read or heard and then retold if they found them interesting? Besides, they try to find out about the authors whose perspectives and ideas shaped the text, as well as the intended audience, as very often authors keep the interests of their audience in mind while composing their work, and they try and ascertain the possible date of the composition or compilation of the text, as well as the place where they may have been composed. It is only after making these assessments that they draw on the content of text to arrive at an understanding of their historical significance. As you can imagine, this is an particularly difficult task for a text as complex as the Mahabharata. Language and content. Let us look at the language of the text. The version of the Mahabharata we have been considering is in Sanskrit, although there are versions in other languages as well. However, the Sanskrit used in Mahabharata is far simpler than that of Vedas or the Prashastis discussed in chapter 2. As such, it was probably widely understood. Historians usually classify the contents of the present text under two broad heads: sections that contain stories designated as narrative, and sections that contain prescriptions about social norms designated as didactic. This division is by no means watertight. The didactic sections include stories, and the narrative often contains a social message. However, generally the historians agree that the Mahabharata was meant to be a dramatic, moving story, and that didactic portions were probably added later. Didactic referred to something that is meant for purposes of instruction. Okay, figure 3.8 depicts the Krishna advises Arjuna on the battlefield. This painting dates to the 18th century. Perhaps the most important didactic section of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, which contains advice offered by Lord Krishna to Arjuna. This scene is frequently depicted in painting and sculpture. Okay, interestingly, the text is described as an idihasa within early Sanskrit tradition. The literal meaning of the term is thus it was, which is why it is generally translated as history. Was there a real war that was remembered in this epic? We are not sure. Some historians think that the memory of an actual conflict amongst kingfolk was preserved in the narrative. Other points out that there is no other corroborative evidence of the battle. Authors and dates. Who wrote the text? This is a question to which there are several answers. The original story was probably composed by charioteer bards known as Sudas, who were generally accompanied Kshatriya warriors to the battlefield and composed poems celebrating their victories and other achievements. These compositions circulated orally. Then, from the 5th century BCE, Brahmanas took over the story and began to commit it to writing. This was the first. This was the time when chiefdoms, such as those of the Kurus and Panchalas, around whom the story of the epic revolves, were gradually becoming kingdoms. Did the new kings want their idihasa to be recorded and preserved more systematically? It is also possibly that the upheavals that often accompanied the establishment of these states were old social values were often replaced by a new norms are reflected in some parts of the story. Okay. Figure 3.9, Lord Ganesha, the scribe, according to the tradition. Vyasa dictated this text to the deity. The illustration is from a Persian translation of the Mahabharata. Okay. We notice another phase in the composition of the text between circa 200 BCE and 200 CE. This was a period when the worship of Vishnu was growing in importance, and Krishna, one of the important figures of the epic, was becoming to be identified with Vishnu. Subsequently, between circa 200 and 400 CE, large didactic sections resembling the Manusmriti were added. With these additions, a text which initially perhaps had less than 10,000 verses grew to comprise about 1 lakh verses. This enormous composition is traditionally attributed to a sage named Vyasa. The search for convergence. The Mahabharata, like any major epic, contains vivid descriptions of battles, forests, palaces, and settlements. In 1951 to 52, the archaeologist B.B. Lal excavated at a village named Hastinapura in Meerut, Uttar Pradesh. Was this the Hastinapura of the epic? While the similarity in names could be coincidental, the location of the site in the upper Ganga Doab, where the Kuru kingdom was situated, suggests that it may have been the capital of Kurus mentioned in the text. Lal found evidence of 5 occupational levels, of which the second and third are of interest to us. This is what Lal noted that the noted about the horses in the second phase, circa 12th to 7th century BCE. Within the limited area excavated, no definite plans of houses were obtained, but walls of mud and mud bricks were duly encountered. The discovery of mud plaster with prominent reed marks suggested that some of the houses had reed walls plastered over with mud. For the third phase, circa 6th to 3rd century BCE, he noted houses of this period were built of mud bricks as well as burned bricks. Soakage jars and brick drains were used for draining out refuse water, while terracotta ring wells may have been used both as wells and drainage pits. Hastinapura. This is how the city is described in the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata. The city bursting like the ocean, packed with hundreds of mansions, displayed with its gateways, arches, and turrets like massing clouds the splendor of great Indra's city. Okay, was the description of the city in the epic added after the main narrative had been composed when after the 6th century BCE urban centers flourished in the region, or was it a flight of poetic fancy which cannot always be verified by comparisons with other kinds of evidence? Consider another instance. One of the most challenging episodes in the Mahabharata is Draupadi's marriage with the Pandavas, an instance of polyandry that is central to the narrative. If we examine the section of the epic that describe this event, it is evident that the authors attempted to explain it in a variety of ways. Okay, a wall excavated at Hastinapura. You can see them here. Okay, present day historians suggest that the fact that the authors describe a polyandrous union indicates that polyandry may have been prevalent amongst ruling elites at some point of time. At the same time, the fact that so many different explanations are offered for the episode suggests that polyandry gradually fell to disfavor amongst the Brahmanas, who reworked and developed the text through centuries. Some historians note that while the practice of polyandry may have seemed unusual or even undesirable from the Brahminical point of view, it was prevalent in the Himalayan region. Others suggest that there may have been a shortage of women during times of warfare, and this led to polyandry. In other words, it was attributed to a situation of crisis. Some early sources suggest that the polyandry was not the only or even the most prevalent form of marriage. Why then did the authors choose to associate this practice with the central characters of the Mahabharata? We need to remember that creative literature often has its own narrative requirements and does not always literally reflect social realities. A dynamic test. The growth of the Mahabharata did not stop with Sanskrit version. Over the centuries, versions of the epic were written in a variety of languages through an ongoing process of dialogue between peoples, communities, and those who wrote the texts. Several stories that originated in specific regions or circulated amongst certain people found their way into the epic. At the same time, the central story of the epic was often retold in different ways, and episodes were depicted in sculpture and painting. They also provided themes for a wide range of performing arts, plays, dance, and other kinds of narrations. Most retellings of or reenactments of the epic draw on the main narrative in creative ways. Let us look at one example, an episode from Mahabharata that has been transformed by Mahasheda Devi, a contemporary Bengali writer known for raising her voice against all forms of exploitation and oppression. In this particular instance, she works out alternative possibilities from the main story of Mahabharata and draws attention to the questions on which the Sanskrit text is silent. This Sanskrit text describes how Duryodhana plotted to kill the Pandavas by inviting them to stay in a specially prepared house of lac, which he planned to set on fire. Forewarned, the Pandavas dug a tunnel to ensure their escape. The Kundi arranged for a feast. While most of the invitees were Brahmanas, a Nishada woman came with her 5 sons. When they were satiated with drink and fell off to sleep, the Pandavas escaped, setting fire to their house. When the bodies of the women and her sons were discovered, people thought that Pandavas were dead. In her short story titled Kundi O Nishadi, Mahasheda Devi takes up the narrative from where the Mahabharata ends it. She sets the story in a forest where Kundi retires after the war. Kundi now has time to reflect on her past and often confesses to what she regards as her failings, talking with the earth, the symbol of nature. Every day she sees the Nishadas who come to collect wood, honey, tubers, and roots. One Nishadi, a Nishada woman, often listens to Kundi when she talks with the earth. One day there was something in the air. The animals were fleeing the forest. Kundi noticed that the Nishadi was watching her and was startled when she spoke to her and asked if she remembered the house of lac. Yes, Kundi said she did. Did she remember a certain elderly Nishadi and her 5 young sons, and that she had served them wine till they were senseless, while she escaped with her own sons. That Nishadi, not you. Kundi exclaimed. The Nishadi replied that the woman who was killed had been her mother-in-law. She added that while Kundi had been reflecting on her past, not once she did not she did did she remember the 6 innocent lives that were lost because she had wanted to save herself and her sons. As they spoke, the flames drew nearer. The Nishadi escaped to safety, but Kundi remained where she was. Okay, timeline 1, major textual traditions. Circa 500 BCE, Ashtadhyayi of Panini, a work on Sanskrit grammar. Ashtadhyayi of Panini, a work of Sanskrit grammar. Circa 500 to 200 BCE, major Dharma Sutras in Sanskrit. 500 to 100 BCE, early Buddhist texts, including the Tripitaka in Pali. 500 BCE to 400 CE, Ramayana and Mahabharata in Sanskrit. 200 BCE to 200 CE, Manusmriti in Sanskrit, composition and compilation of Tamil Sangam literature. 100 CE, Charaga and Sushruta Samhitas, works on medicine in Sanskrit. 200 CE onwards, compilation of the Puranas in Sanskrit. 300 CE, Natyashastra of Bharata, a work on dramaturgy in Sanskrit. 300 to 600 CE, other Dharmashastras in Sanskrit. 400 to 500 CE, Sanskrit plays, including the works of Kalidasa, works on astronomy and mathematics by Aryabhatta and Varahamira in Sanskrit, compilation of Jaina works in Pragut. Timeline 2, major landmarks in the study of Mahabharata. 20th century, 1919 to 66, preparation and publication of critical edition of the Mahabharata. 1973, G.A.B. Van Buitenen begins English translation of the critical edition, remains incomplete after his death in 1978. Okay, we have completed theme 3. In next class, we will discuss theme 4, thinkers, beliefs, and buildings, cultural developments, circa 600 BCE to 600 CE, which is the last chapter, right? Let's look into it. Yes, it's the last chapter of part 1, Ancient India. Okay, thank you very much for listening me. We'll see you in next class. Thank you very much.